two topics we're talking about is really about privacy, and first up, we'll let these guys introduce themselves. But one of the things that came out of the Toronto Waterloo sessions was how privacy is not just about a bunch of laws, but it's about an expectation on the consumer now and being able to understand what you're doing with your data. It's one of those topics that could kill your company, especially in the early days. And we're going to let these two guys talk about how best to avoid it. It's a sink or swim kind of topic.
Thank you, Ivan. My name is Ivan Tsarynny. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Feroot, and we are a software company that specializes in subject access rights fulfillment for software as a service companies, AI companies, and help with GDPR compliance broadly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Evan. I'm Justin Young. I'm a partner at a law firm called Osler Law Harcourt, and I'm in our what we call our emerging high growth company group. Basically servicing startups all the way through to exit in the technology sector and working with venture capital firms and other investors to those technology groups. We work closely as a group with our colleagues in our privacy and data security team that Ivan knows from various offices across the firm. And so, you know, with our client base, particularly in the SaaS space, getting lots of interest and inquiry about how to deal with GDPR and other privacy issues. So it's something that we get all the time, and obviously the earlier stage of the company, typically the less resourced they are to deal with these kinds of things. So it's it's definitely a very topical. We hear a lot about the four letters, the GDPR, and we've heard lots, the previous four letters a couple of years ago was CASL, and obviously privacy, as Greg said, is becoming more and more pervasive. But in our client base, I think there is a fair amount of lack of understanding, education about GDPR and what it really means for companies here in Canada. So maybe we'll just start with Ivan setting the table in terms of what is the GDPR, and at a very high level, make sure we cover that before we launch into specifics.
It is a big question. What is GDPR? I don't think there is a clear answer to that. But speaking with many companies, both small and large, including some of the largest banks, what I'm seeing what GDPR is actually more of a culture change of culture of data, how people respect data, how they treat it, what it means. And just a little kind of example is for the software as a service for a startup community. Historically, the approach was let's collect all the data we can and store it, and then figure out how to use it. Maybe we can monetize it, maybe we can drive some additional value. And so a culture change to data that GDPR is bringing is you cannot do that and be compliant, because there's now a concept of data minimization where you can collect only as little data as necessary to fulfill the business promise that you have with the consumer. So it starts with a culture change, and then trickles down to many other compliance, legal, and operational changes in the companies.
So has anybody here been asked about GDPR compliance in their software company? Put your hand up. Okay. So everybody in the room has sort of had that. Okay, tell me how you're outside. And it's not just, so speaking on GDPR being a European thing, talk about the big macro stuff. I mean, it's not just about European activity, right?
Yeah, definitely not. And how I personally shifted my priority from my previous business to GDPR and privacy compliance is actually over the last few years. We began my other company that I co-founded with Vitaly is PostBeyond, and in PostBeyond what we noticed is over the last couple of years a lot of our enterprise customers began coming back asking to do reassessment, info security reviews, compliance reviews outside of the normal, outside of what they have been doing in the past. So I got really curious why all of a sudden all of the enterprises, especially European ones, are essentially asking the same questions. Why was it happening in 2016, 2017? And to the point, yes, it is very broad. It's much the GDPR has a much broader reach than, in my mind, than any other privacy obligation, the privacy regulation, and we can talk a little bit more about that. And to the reach is even us as a Canadian startup, as a Canadian tech company. Do we process data of EU residents and subjects? Yes, we do. Do we sell services and products to EU markets? Yes, we do. And most other companies, not every single startup or tech company does it, but most need to comply because most offer products and most are processing EU subjects data.
Right, so it's not just having boots on the ground in
Yeah.
Europe, obviously. It's broader than that.
It's broader of that, and also rethinking the relationships and relationships between a data controller, data processors, and the subject. And one of the we chatted earlier about that on the grounds for GDPR. It's actually the biggest kind of culture shift.
Is the application of GDPR going to be the same regardless of the amount of presence you have in Europe? Or is it, does it depend
Yeah.
on what you're doing?
Yeah.
And if it's a small part of your business, does that reduce the compliance risk?
So that is a very interesting, tricky question. What is considered to be enough data or not enough data? So I, for example, participate in some of the groups and privacy groups, and we're actually having a lot of discussions and examples between US companies, EU companies, Canadian. And here's some real examples of where you probably don't have to comply, or it's least likely that you would need to comply. It's the concept of incidental data collection. So if you're a business, you have a coffee shop in Vancouver, and an EU citizen comes in and signs up for some kind of loyalty program, and you have a couple of those, then it will likely be treated as an incidental collection of data. However, if you're a company that is servicing an EU market or is selling software to an EU company that is processing EU data, then it's a lot more likely that you need to comply. And in terms of percentage of data, so out of 100% of your data, maybe 10% of data is EU, it doesn't really affect compliance obligation as long as you're offering services and are processing EU data.
What are the actual things that you're seeing people do to be compliant?
So here's what I'm actually seeing. What I've seen people have done. What I'm hearing the gaps had been exposed after the May 25th GDPR kickoff date. Over the last kind of year or so, a lot of companies have done a lot of assessments. They work with law firms, privacy lawyers, consultants to bring their posture up, update their privacy policies, terms of use, terms of services, all the other legal documents and policies. Then they created some potential product changes to operationalize some of the aspects of GDPR. They introduced encryption in some areas. And now, what had happened over the last 2-3 weeks is companies began getting subject access requests. So subject access requests are somebody, let's call him Bob from UK, calls the company or uses the app and says, I want to know what data you're collecting about me. I want you to delete my data. I want to be forgotten, or I want a copy of my data. So it's subject rights are covered in Articles 12 to 23, 7, 12 to 23. And they want to see what consent they gave. They want to see what, which country, which third country is storing the data. They have now the rights to get pretty broad disclosure on what data is being collected, how is it being used, what is it being used for. So those are called subject access rights, access requests. And when company began getting them, they are not, in many cases, they're not able to facilitate everything that they're obligated to provide. And what is happening as a result, subjects, people, are getting upset and angry and are threatening to complain or threatening to sue. And under GDPR, as you know, there's the scary part, there are pretty hefty penalties. Mm-hmm. And that 4%, up to 4% or 20 million euro penalty, they're actually mostly surrounding the access rights.
4% of global revenue?
Yeah. Global turnover.
Right.
Yeah. This is a real example. In 2017, in Italian DPA, Data Protection Authority, they had penalized and put a penalty of 5.8 million euros on a UK company for breaking consent rules for 583 Italian residents, Italian subjects. And in particular, you can read, there are plenty of articles about that case, is some of the data of those people were stored on the server in China. So that constituted a breach of consent, and they impose a penalty of 10,000 euros per broken consent. So that amounts to 5.8 million euros. So that's a real example. Now, anecdotal stories are, it is a very lucrative source of revenue. And it's a source of penalties. As even in that Italian example, the investigation actually was triggered by an AML, anti-money laundering investigation. And they found, yes, the company broke some AML obligations, but they also broke a much bigger issue around issue around the consent rules, and the penalty was actually higher on the consent rules rather than on AML. Wow. And so that's a pretty significant.
And that's how they're funding the agency, right? So it's kind of like a traffic cop giving out parking tickets, right? So I mean that's just a story, but
it's just a story. I haven't seen their cash flow sheets and how the funds are being distributed, but.
It's a source of income.
Yeah,
it's a potential source of
it is
income.
a potential source of revenues. And obviously the GDPR nature is not to put companies out of business.
Right.
The nature is to enforce human rights and the rights to privacy. However, if there are no penalties, people will not be paying as much attention to it. So they attach to hefty penalties, which is smart.
Yeah, so it's the difference between sort of, we don't have to worry about technical compliance because this is just a privacy issue we're not going to worry about. You add the penalty and all of a sudden it's, business critical. Although I think, for a lot of these examples where you've got fines, can you talk a bit about what you're seeing in terms of the impact on the business, not from just a monetary penalty perspective, but you talked about the subjects being upset and the consumer the consumer side of it.
So the impact is actually greater awareness of subjects or people knowing about their rights, that they have rights around their data. That's a first change that I'm hearing. There's an interesting study from March of this year, Capgemini done a study, and out of 50% of EU responders said that they will act or are likely to act against a company if they're seeing that the company is breaching their obligations under GDPR. So greater awareness of that there are now ways you can influence how the company is treating your data. Other changes, what I'm seeing is, interestingly, some companies, some organizations are treating GDPR as a pure risk avoidance, and they're either making themselves bare bone, they're investing as little efforts as possible to make them feel themselves that they're compliant, or they paused or stopped go-to-market activities in EU until kind of the fog of war settles down and they know what it means to be GDPR compliant. So what effectively is happening is they're losing market share because somebody else is winning market share.
What are most people doing in terms of actually implementing a compliance plan?
Working with with the lawyers who practice EU law, it's probably is. I'm not saying that it is better, but they have more hands and kind of boots on the ground and first-hand experience in London and Paris and Germany on what it means and how the regulators are looking at it, what is happening right now in the trenches. So that's the first step is check all the boxes and work with lawyers. Second is many companies are hiring consultants, like top Big Four, second tier, and small boutique privacy consulting agencies to help them understand create a plan what needs to change, from training staff to changes to the products to changes how they conduct business, and then small portion, kind of most leading companies, when I begin noticing that they're already thinking, okay, privacy is a necessity. We cannot live without privacy. We cannot live without GDPR. And they're beginning to think about it, okay, if we're doing it, how can we leverage it as a business opportunity? In complying with GDPR, you can get a competitive advantage. You can gain market share. You can do more business. It's actually, GDPR is good for business. It's not a risk avoidance strategy. It is a way to build trust, build loyalty from customers, and gain market share. So that's what probably the smallest at this time group of companies is. They're operationalizing it, and they're looking for ways how to make privacy a competitive advantage.
So one other issue that I think, and maybe Greg, you can speak to this a little bit too, when you look at capital raising or M&A opportunities for your company, what do you think not just GDPR compliance, but privacy in general is becoming, at least we're seeing, a bigger issue for investors in their diligence, looking at it saying, what is your compliance strategy? What issues do we have built into your product that we need to deal with? Is that a problem?
I think if you're going to invest, you want to make sure that liability is taken care of, right? Because it could kill your investment, right? And we just heard the story of, PayPal. Imagine, it closed. The breach occurred 2 weeks after they closed the deal, right? Yeah. So if it happened one day before, the deal would have gone, right? It's just, it was. I guess it's good timing for the investors or whatever. But and I'm shocked they didn't find out in their diligence, right? This to me was like, how could PayPal go through all this process and not find the breach? So that's another bigger issue, but you can just see that the cost of failure is so high, it would probably be high on your checklist of investors.
But also I'm thinking, what about the clawbacks and what had happened after the deal?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, the earnouts.
I think they just said, you know what, it's 300 million. Let's just get rid of the liability. It was just write it off, go on. And move on.
But that's from the PayPal point of view, but from the seller's point of view.
Well, I don't know. Hopefully they got good lawyers on that side. But anyway, that was just but more importantly, the 300 jobs are gone, right? It was just, they just gone. So. It's I think more important for all this stuff, right? I think we don't specifically look at do you have the checkbox, but I'm certain we'll start to do that.
And certainly education and awareness of that checkbox is there, whether you know about it or not, it's there. And the liabilities and the risks attached to that checkbox are real, and they are there. Very, very important topic that a lot of people still have not heard of, or did not really connect the entire implication of it to the data that you collect. It has obligations, and obligations do not diminish based on number of third parties and technologies that you use to process the data. So if you're collecting the data on the website and they use CRM and marketing automation, some other AI-based or ML-based software from third parties, and if they're processing that data, the restrictions that comes with the data needs to be passed down to those third parties as well. So they need to be treating it as diligently as you're treating them. So that's the relationship of the data controller and the data processors. So any data that is being collected and passed down to third parties also needs to be passed down with obligations and restrictions.
So for me, just even these sessions, this is the first time I've heard data processor and data controller. Right?
And controller.
Yeah.
Controller, data processor, and processor.
And sub-processors, and a subject on the top.
Yeah.
So now you're talking about 4 layers of you got to comply and take care of all those things. So it's not just about you, but always
Go ahead.
And just in a way, there's a scale of data sensitivity. You can have personally identifiable data that you're selling to others, right? Or that could be hacked, for example. But a lot of businesses are a few steps away from that, where they have data that's anonymized or obfuscated and then aggregated and used for machine learning or used to share collective insights to a crowd, but where it's difficult to trace it back to individuals. Do you have a sense of where the world is going on where the line is drawn between those two and the extent to which you can still use aggregated data quite freely versus whether that will be more restricted?
So that's do you want to repeat the question?
That's a tough question for me to actually put on here, but I guess it's really the line between anonymized data and subject matter data.
So there are articles that actually cover exactly what you just described based on that data. Is it identifiable or is it masked? You cannot identify it or link it to the individuals any longer. So there are articles that cover it. It's, in my opinion, GDPR is probably one of the best written law in human history. It's probably one of the easiest one to read.
So that's something you haven't talked about that. You said you can actually read it and understand it.
It is 250 pages long, one way or another, but it is actually really, really easy to read. And some of those pages are actually half pages and double spaced. So
do they have pictures?
No pictures. But it is one of the easiest law to read. At least in my mind, that was probably the easiest to read. Back to your question on if you're disconnected from the data, I'm always thinking, kind of playing kind of common sense approach. Tell the person what you need, what data you're going to collect from him. Tell him why. Get a consent for that purpose, and then do what you said you're going to do. So that approach typically produces the best types of relationships, and creates trust and loyalty with the person. That's from the consumer point of view. Now, from obligations point of view, if you have consent for automated decision making or some kind of AI-based processing of the data, and consumer was informed, you've communicated, there is a notice, there is a consent, and you can communicate and confirm that that's how the data is being used, and here's how person can request data to be deleted or exported or exercise any rights, then that kind of privacy posture will look a lot more mature in the eyes of regulators, should they kind of dig in and start looking into what are you doing. And the consensus typically is, or what they're looking at is it's the narrative of a company. And the narrative should be, we're a good company, and here's why we're a good company, and we're doing all these kind of things. And if there's an issue had happened, we knew about it, we found that issue, we already probably remediated it, so that will never happen. So it's more about communicating your company story and your narrative around the company. That you're diligent, there is no negligence, you're paying attention, you're being serious about it, and that might be, from the legal point of view, a factor to mitigate penalties altogether or to limit them to a significantly reduced amount.
So we got a data protection agreement request, and we went through all the work and filled it in. And then we had to identify our sub-processors. So for us, it's our CRM and intercom and mix, a bunch of tools like that. But they just asked us to list them. But technically, we're supposed to make sure that they, as our sub-processors, are compliant. Well, obviously, they're all big companies, and they're not going to just do it for us, obviously. And then technically, they would have to have it just cascades to every single company in the world. If they're not all connected and compliant with each other, the whole system. So at what level, how deep down do you have to go to be, what are you seeing?
So what I'm seeing is, it's a very important question. How deep do you go? Yeah. It is today, and probably there's not a single person that will tell you, here's exactly how deep you can go. Here's a couple of examples, like Salesforce stopped selling data through data.com. So because that in a way breaches GDPR obligations. If you look at the rights of data, so if you store your customer's record in CRM in Salesforce, or not to pick on any vendors, if you use a CRM and that subject requests his data or her data to be deleted, can you request and delete that data from the CRM? And can you get confirmation that the data was deleted? And there's no other copies left of it.
Yeah, and you have to have an audit trail. I think you're getting into, you got to show that you actually could.
Which gets tricky when you.
It does get tricky. So that's really, you got to know your audit Salesforce, know your customer, and know your suppliers. Are there role models out there that we can talk to who are doing it well, and someone to look up to from a privacy and customer experience perspective?
Apple, I don't know if you've noticed, Apple has been putting a lot of changes and notifications into their phones, iOS and other products in terms of privacy and security. They are taking an approach that leads people to feel that their data is more safer and secure and more compliant, and they have more privacy controls over their data when it's in an Apple ecosystem. That's what I'm noticing. And when looking at some of the competitors on the phones OS market, there's completely opposite sentiment.
Android.
Like Android, like their sentiment is you can get any data out of anything from the Android. You can collect geolocation, health data, anything else that Android is collecting. Vendors, third-party developers can snoop it or sniff it out. And there was quite a few examples and tests have been done recently to kind of confirm it. Like there was a news about Cambridge Analytica where even they admitted that once they found that they were able simply request and get copies of text messages from Facebook Messenger in plain text. Even they thought it was too creepy. Then they stopped copying. So basically, messages in Messenger were stored in plain text, and any developer could easily request the copies of your messages. So that kind of demonstrates what not to do.
Right. Any further questions before the wrap up? Sure.
I'm just going to throw this in to answer
Yeah.
a couple extra things.
Yeah.
I work a little bit in privacy with myself. PayPal is actually, we mentioned PayPal earlier. It's a great case example in that one of the requirements with any of your third-party vendors that you're using is to disclose not only the vendors that you're having relationships, such as AWS or Intercom.io or any of them. You have to now list not just the vendors, but what information you've provided them and why. And so if you look up PayPal third-party vendors, it's a good case example because we all think being a financial company, they probably don't share much information. But being one of the first international GDPR compliant companies, they listed over 600 companies on their website you can go to right now that they share your information with if you're a PayPal user, and they show why they share it and what information they've shared with. So we all, if we're going for GDPR compliance, have to participate in that now. So that's one part of it is AWS, for example, if you're using it, you have to disclose what information they have on you, and that kind of forces you to think about, are they GDPR compliant? So you can ask them and kind of go from there, making your decisions moving forward.
So yeah, thank you for bringing that topic up. It's actually why we releasing an open standard framework to actually communicate.
So
that.
this is your advert.
Yeah.
So what Feroot does, you never got into that,
Yeah.
but that's part of what your business
Yeah.
model will be.
Yeah.
So.
So Feroot is a software company. The actual framework, it's a framework. It's, you can anyone can follow it without any products whatsoever with us or even using an Excel file. So it's really important is capturing when you're designing a business offering, capturing the intent. Why are you collecting that data? Why do you need that data? And then providing a notice to people, to consumers. Here's why we're collecting the data. Here's what we're going to do with that data. And then securing a consent, not a broader, here's the kind of consents we secure from people, but no, real consent. Here's what we told you. Here's what you agreed to on that particular day and time. And then using the data, monitoring that, what are the third parties, like you mentioned in PayPal, what are they doing? And are they minimizing the data? Are they processing the data only in the purpose that the data was collected for? Or are they processing it in a different ways that will breach GDPR obligations and then can lead to exposures to penalties? And then managing the data. How do you dispose of that? How do you delete it? How do you provide copy of the data when when a user in EU subject has the right to come to PayPal and say, PayPal, give me a copy of my data, regardless who are the third parties who are processing the data. And PayPal has an obligation to provide that data.
All right, so we're going to take a quick 5-10 minute break, grab some coffee, eat the food, and we'll be back up next with driving ROI from your HR activities. So thank you to Justin and Ivan, and you can network. There'll be lots of time to network after too if you want to take it offline and have further discussions.
Greg, just
Justin.
on that point, if you have, if you do want to speak to my colleague Adam Kardash that Ivan does a lot of work with,
Yeah.
or the folks in his team that are doing privacy issues, I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you if it's an initial question. And they, to your comment earlier, they do interface with European Council. So if you want a Canadian person that understands your context to point you in the right direction in terms of who to talk to, they're also a good resource. So let Ivan or myself or Greg know and we can connect you.
It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.